Right. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming on a Friday evening to the History of Science seminar series. Our speaker today, as the classic line goes, needs no introduction, but he's going to get one anyway. Stephen Shapin is the Franklin L. Ford Research Professor of the History of Science at Harvard. He's undoubtedly one of the most influential historians and sociologists of science over these past 4 decades. It's been a while, Stephen. 3.5 decades. Bowser wasn't that long ago. Shapin completed his undergraduate degree at a school near and dear to my heart, Reed College in Portland, where he majored in biology. He did graduate work in genetics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison before he was visited by three ghosts and decided to finish his PhD in the history and sociology of science at Penn. From 1972 until 1989, he was lecturer and then reader at the Science Studies Unit at the University of Edinburgh, where he played a critical role in the renowned Edinburgh School of Sociology of Scientific Knowledge. From 1989, was that 4.5 centuries or decade? From 1789, great year for revolution, Steve decided to bring it to the University of California, San Diego, where he was a professor of sociology until 2003, before taking up his appointment in the history of science at Harvard. He's taught for shorter periods of time at numerous institutions. I'll just name two: the University of Gastronomic Sciences, I'm not making this up, in Pollenzo, Italia, and the School of Advanced Study, University of London, where he was the St. Lee visiting professorial fellow. His books are numerous, absolutely influential, and they include Leviathan, the Air Pump, Hobbes, Boyle, and the Experimental Life, Princeton University Press, 1985, co-authored with a man near and dear to both of our hearts and hearts of other people in the audience, my Dr. Daddy, Simon Schaffer, where they detail the opposing epistemologies of Hobbes and Boyle, and famously conclude that solutions to the questions of the natural order are simultaneously solutions to the questions of the socio-political order. His A Social History of Truth, University of Chicago, 94, analyzes the social world of gentlemen philosophers in 17th century England. He depicts the relations between gentlemanly culture and scientific practice, arguing that problems of credibility in science were practically solved through codes and conventions of genteel conduct, civility, trust, honor, integrity. These codes formed, and many of us would argue still form, an important basis for securing reliable knowledge today. His popular text, The Scientific Revolution, also with Chicago, 1996, which famously starts with one of the great lines in the history of science: "The scientific revolution never happened, and this is a book about it," has been translated into 18 languages. His Scientific Life, A Moral History of a Late Modern Vocation, Chicago Press, 2008, shows how the uncertainties attending 20th century scientific research make the virtues of individual researchers intrinsic to scientific work. From the early 20th century origins of corporate research laboratories and the scientific entrepreneurship of the present, he demonstrates the radical uncertainties of much contemporary science have been made personal virtues more central to its practice than ever before. And in 2010, a collection of his essays, Never Pure, was published by Johns Hopkins University Press, 2010. I have to say that my all-time favorite essay of his and my all-time favorite essay in the history of science was not included, and that is Of Gods and Kings. That's my favorite essay of Shapin, where he shows how disagreements of Newton and Leibniz on natural philosophy and metaphysics were simultaneously disagreements about the role of God in nature and the essence of political representation in the 18th century. His most recent research interests include the history of dietetics and the history and sociology of taste and subjective judgment, especially in relation to wine and food, which we'll get some good, hopefully tonight, examples thereof. He's a regular contributor to the London Review of Books. He's also written for Harper's Magazine and The New Yorker. Drawing upon works of Max Weber and Robert Merton, to name just two of many, Shapin is interested in natural philosophers or scientists, their ethical choices, and the basis of scientific credibility. He played a key role in emphasizing the role of experiment to the creation of scientific knowledge, where experiments were performed and who performed them. His honors are numerous. I'll just name a few: the John Desmond Bernal Prize and the Ludwig Fleck Prize, both of the Society for the Social Studies of Science, the Robert K. Merton Prize of the American Sociological Association, the Erasmus Prize with Simon back in 2005, and most recently, 2014, he received the George Sarton Medal of the History of Science Society for career contributions to the field. His talk today, wonderfully and typically provocative. The social sciences are better than the natural sciences. Discuss. Please join me in welcoming Steve to the Institute.
Thank you, Miles. Miles and I are old friends, and a condition of that friendship is that Miles has promised me a large sum of money, not to mention stories about the old Miles. Or the young Miles. But we may revisit that negotiation. I also apologize, I don't have pictures for you. I think there are two graphs, the only things that I thought I might show, and I think at appropriate points I'll do finger gestures of what the graphs might show if you were looking at them. Now, I have to say at the outset that you're here under false pretenses. Any argument over which of the scientific categories is better, I have to speak no dog in that fight. For my part, I don't think that the question of respective value is meaningful or coherent or especially necessary. I don't believe that there are stable criteria that would allow such a distribution of value. I don't know what aspects of the natural and social sciences would reliably inform such a value judgment. Would it be some aspect of method, say experiment, mathematization, replicability, or would it be the certainty or objectivity of knowledge? Or would it be the power to produce effective technologies or to inform practical interventions that would reliably bring about hoped for outcomes? Or the ability to predict phenomena, or would a contrast of value have to do with the tractability of the phenomena belonging to the disciplines, or would it be which disciplines were said to be fundamental and which derivative? Now, if any of these criteria are supposed to inform a value order, how unproblematic would be their application? What are the stable criteria for finding a body of knowledge, for example, methodologically proper? And in order intelligibly to claim that one sort of disciplines is better than another, you have to consider that they belong on some sort of an array, that you're comparing, as they say, apples with apples, or at least good apples with bad apples. So, for instance, you might say that Princeton is better than Columbia, but you can't meaningfully say that Princeton is better than the Metropolitan Opera. Is the physics sociology comparison like the first, or is it like the second? Since I say I don't know how you would coherently go about assessing value between the scientific types, you might think that I dissolved my topic into meaninglessness and we could all go home now. No such luck. And in a sense, I have dissolved the subject in that way, but whatever I think about the subject, I still have an object, and I hope an interesting one to you. And that's because lots of people have considered that the social and natural sciences can and should be evaluated using the same standards of assessment. That's to say, many people have thought and may still think that the question of which sciences are better is meaningful. And there are institutions that reliably assess the relative value of the different branches of science and whose judgments have real consequences in our world. That's my topic. How has the question question like this, of the betterness of one science over another, how has such a question been framed and answered over time? I'd like briefly to track the history of that array, and then, having tracked it, to look for evidence of a possible future for our classifications and evaluations as we are now. Now, historically speaking, the branches of knowledge have always been subject to distinction and often to comparative evaluation. And of course, those historical distinctions don't conveniently correspond to the taxonomy of modern academic disciplines. Aristotle evaluatively distinguished between episteme, phronesis, and broadly philosophy, prudence, and the wisdom required in the crafts. And he rated philosophical knowledge, knowledge of the necessary and of the eternal, the best, which is what you would expect from a philosopher. Aquinas accounted theology the queen of the sciences, with philosophy its handmaid, which is what you'd expect from a theologian. In the Renaissance, philosophy was accounted more prestigious than mathematics, partly because philosophical knowledge of the nature of things linked it more securely than did the predictive and regularity discerning knowledge of practical mathematics with theology. There weren't traditionally many texts rating practical knowledge more highly than philosophical knowledge, partly because the artisans didn't then write books. In Auguste Comte's 19th century account of positive philosophy, the branches of science were said to appear in chronological order, each relying on historically prior sciences, from the astronomical to the physical, chemical, and physiological. And the last to develop, that was then developing in Comte's time, was sociology, social physics, as he called it. And while its inquiries depended on what came before, sociology was for Comte the queen of the sciences, the culmination, the highest, the most necessary of all. For Comte, the lateness with which the social sciences emerged testified to their position at the apex of progress. The idea that the sciences of social behavior and human judgment should be considered high was neither bizarre nor uncommon in the 19th century. Consider Marxism. Writing shortly before Comte, the French gourmand, Brillat-Savarin, said that gastronomy was not only a science, but the most complete and perfect of the sciences. I have to agree. It contains all the rest. It is a culmination of social progress. It was the merging and fulfilling of chemical science, taste, and the civilized state. The physical sciences pale into insignificance. Brillat-Savarin famously said, "The discovery of a new dish is more beneficial to humanity than the discovery of a new star." Comte's positive philosophy is now a subject of only academic interest, but the notion of a hierarchy of the sciences and of a temporal sequence of subjects from the most simple to the most complex is still part of our present-day cultural furniture. Now, there was, of course, social scientific writing before there were academic disciplines so named, but the social science departments developed from the end of the 19th century, psychology from the 1870s, sociology from the 1890s, anthropology, first in its biological and then in its cultural forms, also from about the 1870s. Different versions of history were and remain differently placed with respect to the category of social science. And institutionally, academic history may come under the charge of the social sciences dean now, as it does at my university, at Chicago, Columbia, Berkeley, and here at Princeton, or it may be administratively placed with the arts and humanities, as it is at Wisconsin, my former University of California at San Diego, and Yale, and my other former University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And as the social science disciplines developed, they found the natural sciences already established in place. Mathematics, astronomy, and physics reconfigured from natural philosophy essentially forever. Chemistry from about the 18th century, and before that, rebranded from medical matters. Biology, geology, given their names and finding their institutional identities from the late 18th and early 19th centuries. It was in those institutional circumstances that the position of these sciences vis-a-vis physics, chemistry, and biology assumed salience. Were they distinctive, and in what ways? Could the methods and resources of the natural sciences be extended to the human and social phenomena, reduced to substrata, rendered lawful, like the laws of physics, subject to controlled experiment, made quantifiable? The human sciences were awkwardly placed, and their professors responded in different ways. If you reduced the human and social to physics, chemistry, and biology, what justified the separate existence of the human science departments? If you insisted on the distinctiveness and autonomy of lived human experience, what criteria made those practices scientific? Could the same standards of evaluation apply to the methods and products of natural and social scientific inquiry? If the study of the human and the natural were incommensurable, then there was no basis for judging the one to be better than the other. And here, of course, there were differences between belonging in Germanic usage to Wissenschaft and belonging to the Anglophone category of science. In 1917, Max Weber gave a lecture at Munich University. The topic was Wissenschaft als Beruf, customarily Englished as science as a vocation. Weber was a sociologist and an historian, but he understood that he was doing Wissenschaft. So whatever he said that pertained to the calling of the physicist or the chemist pertained also to him. There had been, of course, German arguments over the methods and objects of the Naturwissenschaften or the Geisteswissenschaften, but there were arguments taking place within Wissenschaft, systematic and rigorous inquiry. It was important to judge whether human mental phenomena could be accounted for materialistically, but there was little, if any, sense that the human sciences, even in their non-reductionist mode, were inferior. It was possible to say that the one sort was a better version of the other, but there was no necessity in doing so in the Germanic context. It was then just sayable, but not much more than that. Now, the social science disciplines were problematically placed in comparison with the physicists and chemists, the imaginative arts much less so. Their footprint on the institutions of higher education were lighter, and they were freer in their resistance to the cultural superiority of the natural sciences. Early in the 19th century, the Romantics conceived a shared project. Sensibilities of the sublime could be shared between the arts and the natural sciences, both resources to expand the imagination and both reckoned to proceed through the use of the imagination. Later, Darwin's announcement that there was grandeur in the evolutionary view of life, and Ernst Haeckel's intentionally beautiful Kunstformen der Natur were evidence of the relations between science and the arts that were very far from oppositional. Yet opposition did emerge, especially directed towards materialist and reductionist modes of science and towards the claim that aesthetic and moral domains were epiphenomena of a world which knew neither beauty nor morality. As the academic social sciences deliberations went on, fin de siècle, artists, aesthetes, and moral philosophers marked out territory which the natural scientists should not think to occupy. What links Oscar Wilde's 1890 picture of Dorian Gray and G.E. Moore's 1903 naturalistic fallacy in the Principia Ethica is defiance of natural scientific reductionism. You can't get to ought prescriptions from is statements, and art creates, while science can only describe. In 1962, W.H. Auden, speaking at Mount Holyoke College about the civic place of the poet, famously quipped that when I am in the company of scientists, I feel like a shabby curate who has strayed by mistake into a drawing room full of dukes. But Auden was only an occasional visiting academic, professor of poetry at Oxford, where he had to give 3 lectures a year, 3 more than you give here. And he wasn't in a position of scrambling for resources and curricular space. At Cambridge, C.P. Snow was differently placed. A sometimes physics researcher, then an academic administrator, interspersed with spells in government scientific bureaucracy. His celebrated 1959 Two Cultures defense of science against what he called the literary intellectuals was shaped by academic fault lines, tensions that could be experienced not just theoretically, but in person, face to face. From questions of resource allocation to high table conversation. That is, after all, how Snow introduced the problem of art science value. It was an awkwardness at high table. So serious stuff. Yet for all of Snow's worry about gulfs between the two cultures, the social sciences were scarcely mentioned, and certainly not as a type of culture that the literary people don't understand or care about. Revisiting the lecture several years later, Snow offhandedly suggested that perhaps there was then emerging, he said, something like a third culture, to which he called a mixed bag of social sciences and social arts, belonging, and he apologized for his lack of familiarity with these, as he was really only at home, he said, with the established intellectual disciplines, the hard subjects. That's Snow. So my story has arrived at the mid-20th century. By that time, we've had many comparisons between the arts and the sciences, some between the natural and the social sciences, some pointing to fault lines within each contested practice. But what I have difficulty seeing from that point in history is a clear evaluative contrast between the natural and the social. Certainly a contrast that licenses an assessment that the one is superior to the other. Now that situation changes. It changes, I believe, sometime around the middle of the past century. It changes most evidently in this country, and it changes spectacularly. The natural and social sciences were then persistently arrayed. Their comparative worth was then much insisted upon, and the contrast broadened out from something of academic theoretic concern to something that seemed to engage a wide range of actors, some scientists and many who weren't academics at all. Why at that time? Why in the United States? What was at stake? Now, there's several considerations, so to speak, internal to the development of the academic disciplines that might account for that sort of thing. First, there was a tendency, especially marked in American social science, from maybe the 1920s, to emulate what was taken as the scientific method, stressing experiment where possible, quantification where it could be applied, and setting aside of problems to which quantification and experiment could not be applied or that were otherwise intractable. Now, there was no necessity about this evaluation. You could maintain that the phenomena addressed by social scientists and the methods appropriate to their inquiries distinguish them from the physicists and chemists. For example, ideas assembled in Peter Winch's enormously influential 1958 book, The Idea of a Social Science, where that was his argument. And there were versions of social science, for example, symbolic interactionism and ethnomethodology, that did not imitate the natural sciences. But these were losing the battle with their hard-nosed colleagues, and now they have definitively lost it. in this country. Social scientists tended to buy in their notions of scientific method and scientificity in general, not from natural scientists, but from philosophers. Morris Cohen, Ernst Nagel, Adolf Greenbaum, Karl Popper, and later, in a very different way, from Thomas Kuhn, all of whom offered different accounts of what method was and the conditions in which it could be applied to human behavior and beliefs. And insofar as social scientists believed that method could be effectively applied to their research, they could make claims to be like the natural sciences, or at least offer assurances that they would eventually be like the natural sciences. And it was these tendencies that provided conditions for comparative evaluation. Then there were institutional developments that were initially particular to the US that had the effect of ordering the disciplines and also of making their comparative goodness pertinent. The natural and social sciences had long been institutionally arrayed within the structure of a university, and their positions on this array had consequences in the competition for material resources. How much was a university, for example, willing to spend on different disciplines? How was space allocated? You can never underestimate the importance of the allocation of space in academic institutions. But internal academic resources were never abundant, and differences in allocation didn't necessarily follow the natural social divide, or completely so. Theoretical physics was a lot cheaper than experimental physics, and mathematics might be a lot cheaper than sociology. But there was one post-war World War II institutional development that arrayed the disciplines and made positions on that array enormously consequential. And this was the explosively new role of the federal government in deciding which basic sciences, that is, sciences done within universities, should receive state funding. The most important site for that post-war array was the new National Science Foundation, proposed as the war was ending in 1945 and finally coming into existence after years of fierce debate about what it should do. Although President Truman was not hostile to the idea of the NSF supporting the social sciences, the natural scientists and engineers who took the organizational lead were not keen. 5 years of argument ensued until the NSF began operations in 1950. Lots of things about the new institution were contentious, especially the constitutionality of letting scientists decide who would get taxpayers' money. But one matter that was debated then still hasn't gone away, and that was how much money should go to the different disciplines and to the different categories of disciplines. At its founding, NSF money was distributed amongst the disciplines of natural science, and that distribution was, as it remains, contentious enough. But should the social sciences be supported at all? Formally, the answer was maybe. The social sciences were not mentioned by name in the founding documents and legislation as potential recipients, but after the natural sciences were taken care of, there was the legal category of other sciences, which kept open the possibility of funding for sociology, psychology, and the like. The omission of the social sciences was a vexed question. While the natural scientists might not rate them very highly, some sociologists, some social scientists were closer to state power than the physicists. Economists, of course, even before the econometric turn, but also the social scientists central to New Deal reforms and later to the Kennedy-Johnson Great Society reforms. The natural scientists might stalk the corridors of power, but the economists were in the throne room. Proposals explicitly to include the social sciences as NSF recipients emerged in the 1950s, and they never went away, with revived plans through the 1980s. My only grant that I've had from the US federal government came when I was a member of a sociology department, and it was from the National Science Foundation. Thank you. And it was in these connections that the ascribed inferiority of the social sciences became both a cultural and a political institution. They were arrayed on a scheme of value, not because it was natural to do so, but because arraying the disciplines was the concern of both NSF managers and of the politicians who dispersed funds, as it was a concern of scientists who advised the government or who sought to do so. This was the setting, the post-war setting from the 50s through the 60s, for outbursts of hostility from several distinguished physical scientists. Oppenheimer was, on the whole, supportive, but his wartime colleagues Vannevar Bush and Carl Compton at MIT were very rude. The social sciences were little more than common sense, or they were moralizing tricked out as science, or they were overreaching their real capabilities of predicting, explaining, and intervening. Later, Richard Feynman said that the social sciences were pseudoscience. They didn't get anywhere, they didn't do anything, they didn't mean anything. The politicians in appropriations hearings arrayed the sciences persistently. They were not interested in settling Geistes Naturwissenschaft debates, nor in contributing to philosophical arguments over the demarcation problem. Instead, they just wanted to know which activities deserved the dollars. They took distinctions between the sciences, as it were, off the shelf, not greatly concerned with philosophical niceties, but the idea of an evaluative array was central to their practical judgments, and it was the politicians and their associates in journalism who propelled the array into general cultural consciousness. There were a number of reasons why hostile congressmen considered the social sciences to be inferior to the natural sciences. The criticisms were incoherent in the sense that they were all over the place. One sort formally contradicted another. So, for example, the social sciences were assumed to be infiltrated by ideology, usually of the left-wing sort, and were therefore dangerous, or there were little more than ordinary knowledge dressed up as proper science and were therefore trivial. They delivered no concrete technologies, no bombs, no miracle cures. They didn't solve social problems, and they didn't predict social happenings. They were riven with controversy, one social scientist disputing the findings of another, and so unable to contribute to coherent policy. Some politicians were advised and believed that the methods of social science were so different from the natural that they shouldn't be arrayed, and more practically that they had no place in a government agency supporting physics and chemistry. And while this argument didn't result in a clamor for a national social science foundation, though there was a bill proposing it, it was an argument why they didn't belong to an agency funding physics, in other words, out of the NSF. This is also the context in which the language of hard science and soft sciences emerges. The Google Ngram graph goes like this: hard, soft, hard science, soft science until 1955 and 60, and then like hockey stick. And later I will wave my hands in the air to show you what happens in more recent decades. Long-standing American technocratic sentiments also figured in these contexts, with engineers, including former President Herbert Hoover, a chemical engineer, suggesting that the problems which the social scientists had notably failed to solve, race relations, crime, communism, juvenile delinquency, should be reformulated and resolved as engineering problems. Right-wing columnists in the late 60s said that when the NASA engineers had finished with the moon landings, they would be free to sort out all sorts of social problems. And indeed, from the 1940s through the 60s, mathematicians and physical scientists were developing tools intended to bring social and political problems into their domain. Operations research, game theory, and mathematical modeling addressed to nuclear strategy, economic and voting behavior, and ethics. This institute, along with RAND in Santa Monica, was one of the centers of this kind of work, substantially led by John von Neumann and the economist Oscar Morgenstern. Experts brought in to advise the NSF about which, if any, of the social sciences might deserve funding identified an array of social science practices, those which more or less resembled the natural sciences in their methods, and the experts effectively suggested that NSF funding, should go to those that were most mathematized and most experimental. Within the universities, the importance of monies from the overheads accompanying government grants contributed to the evaluative array. The scientists and engineers got big grants with big overheads. The sociologists contributed very little to the funds coming into the universities. So the academic accountants had every reason, as they still do, to think the natural sciences to be better than the social sciences. I was once told by an administrator at the University of California that sociology was paid for by the overheads from the physics department. Maybe even true. These discussions over money projected the idea of an evaluative array into the consciousness of the social science disciplines themselves. An academic discussion of the differences between the natural and the social sciences were charged up by the material consequences brought about by the injection of large amounts of money into what had largely been a philosophical and largely polite discussion. All of the social sciences in the post-war period addressed that disciplinary array systematically. The array was important to the social scientists, showing how they were and ought to be placed vis-a-vis the natural scientists, how they were doing, and whether and when they might achieve the same sort of standing. By and large, social scientists then accepted their lower place on the array. Prestige was one soft index that the physicists outranked the sociologists, but in this country, cash was a hard index. And this was the context in which a number of social scientists addressing the array rediscovered or discovered Auguste Comte's 19th century notion of a hierarchy of the sciences, especially the Coles at Columbia University. Some accepted Comte's historical perspective in which the social sciences were immature, but when their time came, they would represent the culmination of progress. And yet social scientists' interest in the hierarchy of the disciplines had one paradoxical effect. The sociologists led the way in developing methods by which intuitions about the disciplinary array could be turned into hard data. What's called scientometrics was pioneered from the 1960s as a hard-nosed, call it scientific way of measuring various types of scientific goodness, especially notions like progress and influence. You could use scientometric techniques, measuring citations, co-citations, H-indices, impact factors, eigenfactors that have for some time shaped the environment in which we academics live. Scientometrics could serve, and it has long come to serve, as a quantitative measure of how well a discipline is doing and of how well an individual practitioner was doing. That's the sort of thing we're all now well aware of, except here. That our administrators make sure that we're aware of these measures, that they use them to assess us and to inform us whether we're any good. And these techniques are originally crafted by social scientists, historians of science, linguists, information and library scientists, work as both inducements and constraints on scientific work, the work of physicists as well as the work of psychologists. As we approach the present, what can be competently said about the natural social science distinction? What I'm going to say is in part impressionistic and anecdotal, but the present, quite frankly, interests us more than the past. Even as an historian, I live in the present, and I hope it's excusable in these matters to be a bit impressionistic. First, I suggest that there's a lot less interest in that distinction than there was in the period from the late 19th century to the middle of the past century. So the engram that goes up from 1960 for hard science, soft science, goes up to about the 1880s, and then it flattens, and there's some suggestion that it's actually declining. That's soft evidence, even though it's quantitative. So I think there is a lot less interest. Less quantitatively, philosophers and social scientists do continue to write papers about this sort of thing, about the hierarchy of the sciences, but there's less of this commentary and it's less highly charged up than it once was. The scientometricians intermittently address the hierarchy of the disciplines. Just got a paper to review this morning from AJS on the hierarchy of the disciplines. It's astounding. But their purposes seem either the display of their own methodological virtuosity, or they try to serve administrative concerns, helping administrators sort out who's good and who's not good. One reason why one might say that the passion has gone out of the natural social distinction might just have to do with habituation. I noted that the social sciences were relatively late arrivals in research universities, and to some extent, they still haven't arrived. Oxford didn't have a department of sociology until 1999, and St. Andrews University in Scotland still doesn't have a department of sociology. And their sometimes rocky road to acceptance could be ascribed to that recency and to a perception that they might not be what was then considered properly academic, tainted either by ideology or by overly practical concerns. This was when being practical was considered to be a bad thing. But over time, the academic disciplines have learned to rub along with each other, sometimes grudgingly, sometimes not. And the charge has also largely gone out of the contest over relative funding. Patterns once subject to controversy have acquired the patina of tradition. Anyway, the physicists have recently been having a hard time getting money for new accelerators, and there are strands of social science whose call on big money for equipment has been highly effective. But there are other changes in recent decades that bear on the place of the social sciences and on the value attached to them. And here, one needs to recognize an institutional development which is not new, but which has become more pronounced and consequential as we approach the present. One pertinent development is institutional, to do with where science happens and how it is put to work. Most scientific inquiry and most deployment of scientific expertise does not take place in the institutions of higher education. It happens in government institutions and in those allied to government, and it takes place in profit-making organizations. The NSF, by the way, knows this, and its science indicators produces abundant documentation of this fact. It's accelerating, but it was there in the early part of the 20th century. Now, as I said, that's not new, but the visibility of science outside of academia has, I think, increased. And it's increased along with a diminished ideological interest in demarcating science from technology, practical outcomes, and a heightened interest in displaying the material, social, and economic consequences of academic research, which, of course, has a lot to do with the role of both government and the commercial funding of universities. Technology and applied science used to be considered bad. Now it's considered, shall we say, very good. When one thinks about science in industry and in the state, one used to think of the physical sciences, and many people's minds still go that way. But all sorts of scientific expertise have been folded into the concerns of government and industry, and this includes the social sciences. The state has long, and I mean back to the 17th century in the work of people like William Petty, needed to know facts about its inhabitants to make the state legible. Their sorts, their modes of interaction, their desires and frustrations. After all, that's how statistics got its name. The military has long needed to know facts about its soldiers, their capacity to give and take orders, the bonds that induce them to fight or to flee, what they will and will not eat. For a long time, industry didn't reckon they had much need of social science expertise, or at least of the academically sanctioned sort, but that was already changing in the early decades of the past century. First, industrial sociology, sometimes tracking back to work done at Harvard and Chicago, offered answers to practical questions about what incentivized workers, the Hawthorne experiments that you may have heard of. Then the institutionalization of the HR department, the human resources department, first largely concerned with hiring, evaluating, and compensating personnel, laterally also with managing complaints about discrimination, abuse, and diversity. The HR department and the marketing and advertising departments were usually distinct arms of a commercial organization. But I want to draw attention to business and government modes which draw social science into closer conjunction with natural scientific and technological expertise. Few governmental or commercial activities are structured by disciplines. There are some, but not many. True, there are engineering departments and sales departments in businesses, departments of labor and departments of health and housing in government. But governmental and commercial institutions are typically organized not by disciplines, but by projects. The project may be, for example, developing and marketing a new smartphone, a dating app, a fast food chicken sandwich, settling military and political policy towards the Ukraine, rolling out a COVID vaccine program, or writing an AI system for devising lectures like this and convincing the audience that they were written by an actual human being. Yes. Projects of this sort mobilize and deploy experts coming from different disciplines, but they are not oriented to the value structures of the different disciplines. They are instead focused on realizing the goals of a project, which is in its nature complex, dependent on solving problems whose components call on the skills of, for example, chemists, electrical engineers, sensory scientists, immunologists, epidemiologists, and increasingly of social scientists. In settings like this, it makes little sense to array and value the different disciplines, since their various members direct their skills to achieving an institutionally defined project goal. In the COVID pandemic, for instance, prediction and management of the disease depended crucially on knowing how the virus was transmitted. So increasingly, fluid dynamics, immunology, epidemiology, and mathematical modeling, but also on knowing how the virus was transmitted, since contagion goes from one person to another. In other words, it is human interaction that one needs to understand how the virus is transmitted from person to person. And so sociology and social psychology were an integral part of this. I have to say I know more about the British case than about the American case, but the recruitment of sociologists and social psychologists, who I think gave excellent advice, was systematically ignored by the British government in the formulation of policy. And I can talk, if you like, about where they got the notion of behavioral fatigue, again, which you may have heard of. Similarly, with the new chicken sandwich, chemists of various sorts for compounding the thing, sensory scientists for understanding the relations between what is in the sandwich and consumers' sensory and aesthetic responses, sociologists and psychologists for understanding who would like what, at what price they would buy it, how the thing should be presented and advertised. It's plausible in this way to consider companies like Apple, at one recent time, the most valuable company on the planet, as the design company, even a company for which aesthetics is at least as valuable as electrical engineering. A company skilled in finding out what people want, giving them what they want, predicting what they may be made to want, and then giving them that. At the leading edge of high-tech, companies like Apple, Intel, Netflix, Meta, Amazon, and Google need to know about attitudes, about how various technologies are being or will be used, about what people like, dislike, about how they communicate likes and dislikes, about what young people are wearing, doing with their phones, and think is cool. And at the leading edge of our political life, companies like Cambridge Analytica tell their clients how finely defined groups of people will vote and how they might be made to vote as their clients wish. Inquiries into people's interactions, identities, perceptions, likes and dislikes can serve as a working definition of what academic social science is and has long been about. In the world in which we now live, the results of such inquiries have enormous cash value, and they belong to governments and late capitalist corporations as much, more than they belong to the social science disciplines in academia. There is little, if any, point in identifying that sort of knowledge as less potent than that of physicists. Then part of the story, a related part, has to do with technology. The technologies of gathering, assembling, and interpreting knowledge of human attitudes, perceptions, and interactions are increasingly not auxiliaries to profitable material technologies. They are rather the profitable products themselves. As we move around on the web, we tend to think we're looking for information and for things to buy, but as we're coming to realize, we are not the customer, we are the product. In the world of big data and the technologies for gathering it, the social sciences are central actors. They're involved within the corporations that assemble big data. Collaborations between university social science and corporations are increasingly common, not least because data about people and their interactions that used to belong to the state and to the universities now belong to companies. Companies whose data gatherers have commonly passed through the departments of academic social science, acquired their skills there. It isn't easy to say that social science in these modes is weak, ineffective, pointless, nothing more than common sense dressed up as jargon. And indeed, we don't hear quite so much of that sort of thing these days. Rather, we tend to hear, and I'm thinking, for example, the work of Shoshana Zuboff, rather, we tend to hear about the powers and even the dangers of social science in these modes. The world of big data about human behavior may be to social science what the atomic bomb was to physical science, evidence of power. So we may, and that's still speculation, be leaving the world in which it was sensible to say that the natural sciences were better than the social sciences, not to enter a world in which the opposite is accounted true, but one in which the evaluation fades away, becomes pointless, and in which a talk like this, addressing the different goodness of the natural and the social sciences, becomes even odder than it is. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for such a thought-provoking lecture. Very nice one. Uh, yeah, we heard about the government funding of the scientific research. But what is your opinion about how other social factors like pragmatism, like capitalism, and then the changing pattern of imperialism, all these factors over the last few centuries, not just the last century, not just the 20th century, but over the 16th, 17th, 13th centuries, how that imperialism, capitalism, pragmatism, in totality, how they played a role in the evolution of science and the focus on data, on knowledge, how that took us away from the focus on wisdom.
Well, the questions are obviously pertinent. If the question is, what were the social scientists not then so named contributing to these enterprises, your provocation is good. They were right there at the center, but the case I happen to know best is of course, William Petty, the development of political arithmetic, the Downs survey, which is a survey as it has been said of making the state legible, quantifying its people, what they have, who they are, also bills of mortality, so enterprise of public health. And in the voyages of exploration and colonization, finding out who they were, tabulating them, reducing the data, bringing them back, allowing not just through maps, but through ethnography. And indeed, the important enterprise of medical botany, as Bruno Latour would say, assembling on a tabletop information about people and things at a distance that would allow you to act at a distance. Now, so insofar as we've had an appreciation of this, is largely cartography, navigating on an open sea, but knowing who the people were. So when you have in the earliest voyages of discovery, besides the cartography, the navigation of getting there, attention turned almost immediately to who the people were, whether they were naked, whether they were promiscuous, whether they had kings and queens, and what they ate. Anthropology. So the provocation is a good one, but my talk wasn't about the deep history of the social sciences in these activities. It was specifically, I was trying to play with the idea of an evaluative array, and that's, I think, a question to the side.
Steve, it's Angela here. I really enjoyed your analysis. It seems spot on to me. One category that came up a few times was that of art. And I have to say that whereas I think that the social sciences have been fully accommodated within the university administrative practices of evaluation and especially giving out research grants, I happen to sit on the university board that gives out small grants to professors who need to do things. And it's those who are in the Lewis Center for the Arts at Princeton that really confound us. What does it mean to need to go to Oregon for 3 weeks so you can produce your book of poetry? Or, you know, is it a part of research to have to pay for the fabrication of massive amounts of things out of steel or ceramic? I'm curious whether you think that the demarcation of what is research that might have used to, you know, be a problem between the natural and the social sciences now stands between those categories and that of artistic or creative work.
You know, excellent provocation. I don't know, though. I've also examined fine arts, because what I can tell you, and it may not satisfy you, your question, is I think the problem of what constitutes research in the arts remains deeply problematic. But I think the arts have an enormous advantage over the social science, and it's this: they sell tickets. And I think a number of universities, and I give you Warwick in the UK and my former University of San Diego, have a healthy appreciation of the arts, because people will pay for the arts. They will not pay for social theory, except through their tax money. So you know what I mean? So I wonder if the difficulty of defining what constitutes inquiry, and by the way, in the MFAs that I happen to have examined, they could pass just as easily. You know, I think of Peter Gallison's work making movies. They could pass easily for a novel mode of doing historical and social scientific research. I give you museology too. And the number of our colleagues are doing splendid work with television, radio, and especially museum work. Simon Schaffer, for example. I don't think these activities have a handicap. I think they have an advantage over social science. But it's a thinky. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Janet Vertesse, nice to see you. I'm curious about your take on the rise of new interdisciplinary science and social science crossovers, especially since the beginning of the 21st century. Digital humanities, computational social science, sociogenomics, cyber infrastructures, human-computer interaction, the list sort of goes on, right? And there's a lot of interesting innovative ties at the NSF, for instance, between social and behavioral sciences and the engineering directorates. And that's really increased. It's ramped way up in the last 10 years, but the last 20. So I'm wondering what that does to the array that you're laying out here. Is this an example of the distinction between science and social sciences falling apart? Is this an example of the social sciences trying to tack on to some of the credibility of the sciences, especially the technical sciences, and perhaps also the money there? Are they on the equal playing field? Just curious about your thoughts there.
I think, I know what you're talking about. And what I'm going to agree in there, I may give you a counterexample, but I think it is in evidence, at least in my terminology, of the project. Now, in other words, you need people, translational medicine. And there was a long period of great resistance to this, because here's the medicine, forget about the patient's perceptions. But a growing realization at leading medical schools that you have to know about the patient to, and look, the COVID epidemic was a great example of that. The enormous amount of energy trying to figure out what people's attitudes to vaccines were, how it might be overcome. So what I'm saying briefly is I think these are examples of the project. I mean, what you might prompt me to think about is what is going to happen to the disciplines, because we look at the university now, and especially our dean's encouragement of interdisciplinarity, which, by the way, is a phrase that dates from the same time as the hard science, soft science, 1960, interdisciplinarity, yeah. And in the engineering department, the project organization of education is almost standard, which is not for us. But can we foresee a future in which a research university, in which the departmental disciplines wither away, or have some sort of propedeutic role as preparing people to go on to project work? I think we can. Whether it happens or not, I don't know. But what we do see now is that people acquire the skills that go into projects, either as electrical engineers or as social scientists, passing through the disciplines. So if the disciplines are going to wither away, I think it's going to be a slow withering, because I think if industry and government pay the piper, then for all the talk of teamwork and interdisciplinarity, they will want the people that they recruit to acquire the specialized skills that are now the property of the disciplines. And that's wild speculation. But if you look around the university, and Harvard, I think, is very little different from, say, UC San Diego, the deans want more and more interdisciplinarity. External funding agencies want more and more interdisciplinarity. And we're constantly encouraged to form teams to deal with complex problems, which are technological and social at the same time. Most of people I know in the humanities and social sciences are dragged into this kicking and screaming, but they're losing, I think. You know, I've been part of such a project team, which didn't work very well, but I think that was our fault.
Thanks for this, Steve. I'm curious. I agree with the larger arc, and I'm likely to be persuaded by it because I think we look at the same data. But I'm interested about the social sciences as you define them as a unit. And there was one that you almost didn't mention until very late, which strikes me as the 800-pound gorilla, which is economics. Economics and finance are much bigger. And though I like this idea that the skills of the social science departments are animating the new economy, if you look at where majors are, they're kind of in economics departments.
Yeah.
That's kind of where the money is,
Yeah.
and that's where the salaries are. So what happens when you break out economics from the social sciences and run your tape again? Is it a different story, or is it the same story?
Can I say a bit of both? First of all, the economists that I was arguing, which are in the throne room of power in the days, not just the New Deal, but Hoover, and then in the Great Society, were not full-blooded econometricians. So the conception of economics as an outlier, because it is defined as econometrics, is a historical window, and it's enormously powerful, and therefore, and the economists that many of us know don't want to sit next to the sociologists, especially the gender sociologists and the social theorists and the sociologists of knowledge. But you have noticed, I'm sure as we all notice, the discovery of a thing called behavioral economics. And I am not going to speculate about what the future of behavior, in other words, economics as if people existed. Preliminary evidence is that it's gathering steam. I mean, Tversky and Kahneman got a Nobel Prize in what? Economics. So can I leave this as an open question? What I've tried to say is the econometric window making economics a different, the 800-pound gorilla, I'm suggesting might turn out to be a window, historical window. And let's see what happens with behavioral economics. Because then it would not be an outlier.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Peter Myers. There are a lot of elements in the story that you're assembling here that I would love to discuss under other circumstances, but I'm trying to think of the larger structure of the thing, and it seems to me that much more than the absence of economics, the, so to speak, the real missing element in the story, and I think you need to take a lot more seriously, is the humanities. And the only time you used the word humanities was in this last 2 sentences ago or 3 sentences ago. And I don't think you can do this without that, because, so to speak, the humanities function as a third body in this moving gravitational field over time, and it's absolutely fundamental for how the sciences take shape in the way they take shape, how the social science, and blah, 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 all the things that you're, I think, rightly on. But it's having started with distinguishing the Geisteswissenschaft, Naturwissenschaft distinction from how science works in the United States, you just come back to talking about science. And many of the things like occasional references to social theory, nobody thinks of social theory as a social science. It just doesn't work that way, especially in sociology departments. It's not scientific.
It's there.
It's there, but it's a different element. It's a different thing. And it's operating in a different tradition, a different structure. And that's where, if you don't draw the overlapping circle of the humanities to show how the pull of that and the formulation of the humanities from, this is a different history than what you're accustomed to, but from 1919 through 1965, I don't see how you can do what you're doing.
No, you're right. I'm not going to put a fight about that. I think, and I did say something about the ambiguous place of humanistic enterprises like history. I mean, are there social sciences or not? Well, it depends on what version of history. You suggested social theory is not part of sociology. I can tell you it's an uncomfortable part because I did it, but it is part. And again, I tried to indicate, and perhaps not enough, that the humanities and especially the arts, there is a story to be told about the pragmatic re-embedding of the arts in the kind of project late capitalist concerns. And I think that argument is good. And it's a pathetic excuse of lack of time and space, but I'm accepting what you say. Now, my original job was at the University of Edinburgh, and the Scottish ideology of education is start with philosophy, start with a systematic reflection on the nature of knowledge, the nature of society, and the nature of the moral order before going on to the special subjects. so that it was assumed, as it was in the Scottish influenced liberal arts college that I went to, is that a broad grounding in the introductory foundation year course I took was called the humanities. I have to point out, and I argued with the college for decades since, that the only thing that was missing from the humanities were the sciences, and they ought to be there. So it's an ongoing argument, I think, not just about the epistemic place of the practices, but of the curriculum. Yeah. Other than that, I want to talk, but I don't want to fight on that subject. I should.
So I'm a scientist, but I have always loved the social sciences. So it's from that perspective, I have, as an outsider, I have the following question. I realize you can only do so much in an hour, but obviously, all the subfields of the various social sciences, and also all the debates between those, whether within psychology or within anthropology or between them, have had enormous methodological battles that in many ways have been even more fraught and played a larger role within the disciplines than the ones that you focused on. So they've helped to define the disciplines and so forth. So I wonder if you could say something about the interplay between what you focused on today and those, let's say, more internal battles at various scales over the past few decades.
Well, I'm most familiar with it, having been in a sociology department, with the debates within sociology, and we dichotomized them, the sort of Manichaean conception. There was quals and quants. What struck me about those? They were so ill-defined. They were more stylistic, I thought, than they were substantial. So that if you tried, as I tried, to engage people, see, the problem for someone like me, sociologist of science or historian of science, as I encounter my social science colleagues that were being scientific, and I would say, why do you think this is being scientific? Do you know anything about what happens in a wet Monday in a chemistry lab? And as I did mention, that they took their, and Thomas Kuhn was all over this, the what he called the kind of textbook example of positivist philosophy was not taken even from philosophers, and it wasn't taken from scientific practice. It was taken from textbooks from the scientific method. And that's where my colleagues, I came to thought, had got their conception, but they were resistant. So if they would politely listen to stories about concrete scientific practice, past or present, it was water off a duck's back. So I became aware what was really going on was not, if you like, epistemic, but institutional. These were insignia of membership in strands of a discipline. I'm sounding a bit rude, and I don't really mean to. But there was a complete resistance to finding out what the natural sciences or any form of the natural sciences were like in concrete practice, the kind of thing that people like Miles and the historians and sociologists of science have dedicated themselves to doing, the concreteness of what it is to do a piece of scientific work, to make the experiments, to communicate and make them credible. I found that my quantitative scientific colleagues were not interested. And I'd hope that that would be a basis for an interesting conversation. And I think that still describes the state of the important strands of social science, especially in America, that aim to be, as they think of it, scientific. Now, can I say one thing about mitigation? When I'm talking about the integration of social science into these powerful civic practices, it's not really theory. It's skills in data gathering, surveying, and data interpretation, which is effectively acquired in social science departments, but almost as a in many cases as an ancillary to something substantive. It may be the employable skill par excellence, handling big data, which of course is increasingly characterizes what social science is.
Thanks very much for your talk. I'd love to return, if you wouldn't mind, to the question of the humanities. And I'd like to return to it because I was really interested, compelled by what you had to say about behavioral economics. And part of me believes that behavioral economics exists in part because of the model of humanistic inquiry and humanistic methodologies. And, you know, one of the key subjects of the humanities, or two of the key subjects of the humanities, are communication and intersubjectivity. And those are at the heart of behavioral economics. And I'm wondering if there's a way, if you wouldn't mind just beginning to say a little bit about how you would understand the same kind of, how you might draw or tell a parallel story about the humanities and the social sciences in, as you did. That is to say, what if the question is, what about the humanities? What would you say about have the social sciences increased in value or become less devalued in part because they're beginning to look more like the humanities and drawing on humanistic methods and seeming more relevant rather than just about big data or arguments
So if I
about
understand,
data?
you were saying the humanities are becoming more, the social sciences are becoming more like the humanities?
Well, I think what you're saying is that the social sciences are less and less disparaged. And
Yeah, yes,
and my claim is that that's in part because they've learned something from the humanities. And I'm asking you if
Yeah.
you think there's something to that, or
I
no.
made a different argument, and you may well be right. I'm saying, what I was saying is I think they're becoming less and less disparaged, not because they're more like humanities, but because they have become the masters of knowledge of human attitudes and interactions, which are not humanistic. In other words, we don't have to know about actual people to know about how to generate online advertising for you. If that's called humanistic, I have a problem with that. It is knowledge of, it is actually authentic knowledge of human behavior, but it's not, as it were, interpretative knowledge of human experience. But it sells. It's an argument that you and I certainly share. I was giving a descriptive account of what I think is happening. As we all know, the humanities per se are being hollowed out by students voting with their feet. So we had better do what we're going to do while we still have any students. Let me think. I don't think, and no, I would love to talk further in another context, but I think there are varieties and varieties. One conception of the humanizing of the social sciences is neither, strictly speaking, say phenomenological, and not strictly speaking data-driven. It's addressed, as you might say, it was early in the 20th century, to a series of problems that make sense to our students and also make sense to our political structures. So when I was teaching in sociology, especially at a public university like California, what the students were interested in, understandably and in some sense laudably, race, gender, equity, the environment, not a bad thing. Social theory, methods if they had to. So sociology, in a way, has returned, I think, to being understood as a collection of problems which students may seek to resolve, but may seek to have validated through an educational experience, which is a different thing.
Before we wrap up, I wanted to ask the people and if there's anyone on Zoom who had a question. If not, I think please join me in thanking Professor Shapin for a wonderful talk.